Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome everybody to our October Friday Live. Last month we were at Neb's Fun World, which was if you had a chance to watch that, it was really, really neat. It was a great opportunity for us because that was the first time our virtual team got a chance to meet, with the exception of just a couple people, unfortunately. And but it was a really, really Jeff has got a very, very neat implementation of the software that he's developed there. We're going to try to make it back there again and just get some highlights and some things like that. We'll put that together in a video clip coming up. This week, I'm just going to share my screen here as we get cracking here. Today, we're going to talk about some of the techniques and tips that we use for building awesome apps. And we build quite a few apps. On average, we deliver an app I would say maybe every 2 weeks or so. Depends on the size of the app and the project, but roughly every 1 to 2 weeks, we're finishing building something. So we always got maybe 4 or 5, 6 things on the go, internally as well as externally, as in terms of consulting. And we wanted to share some of the things that we've been using and some new stuff that we've been using to build apps and to make them better. And so that's our main focus for today's talk. As we go along, this meeting is recorded, so if you miss anything, don't worry. We'll add show notes, and you can always find those under our Friday Live page in Notion. There's a link to that right from the app, but there's also a link to it in the emails that you would have received. And I wanted to start off with going through our roadmap and seeing where we are and what's happening sort of behind the scenes with BetterForms. A few things. We've removed some of our older versions. We had a number of legacy versions that we were running in our data centers, and we did that because we kept those running because there were some breaking changes. And some of them date back almost 4 years old, and we didn't want to force our developers to have to update to these new things. So we kept those for as long as we can, until most of the apps were either through attrition or they were just naturally updated, and they've moved off. So we've removed those from our data centers. Now, why that's important to you is it gives us a little bit more resources and allows us to have a little bit better deployments and support for some of these newer features that are coming along, which I'm going to talk about. A couple things in the works. We are just in the process of adding a proxy, which is basically that's this one right here. And what the BetterForms proxy is it allows you to, if you're working with an enterprise environment and you need to have a fixed IP, because we have the dynamic nature of our data centers, our IPs that are providing, that are web serving your apps can periodically change. So the BetterForms proxy will basically act as an in-between between our network and your FileMaker server, and that'll always give you the same IP address. And that's going to be available probably over the next few weeks. It's just in test right now. That's something that Eduardo and one of our team is working on, and it's coming along. Version control and rollback. I was just demoed this the other day. This is pretty neat. This is, we don't have a demo for it just yet, but basically the idea here is you can go back to past versions of your page and you can roll them back. There's a few UI things, more workflow things that we want to work out, like what happens when a developer rolls it back and then they roll it forward and then they roll it back and make a change, and how do we handle all of those branches so nothing is lost. But this is going to be really, really good because there are times we know that you go and make a change to your page and maybe you break something and you're not sure what's happening there. So that's coming. We're starting off with releasing that version control. The rollback will be in the forms, and then we'll have it on sites, and then we'll eventually have it into environments as well. Currently, internally, BetterForms does all of the version control and tracking of this stuff, but it's not surfaced in the UI. Continuing to work on our graphic user interface page builder. I'm not going to demo that today because we're going to be limited for time, but that's still in the works. In-app notification system, that's another project. And performance optimizations. This is a new one here, is our global search. And basically global search is a search that we're going to be adding into BetterForms over the next 3 months. And it's basically allows you to search anything. So you can kind of think of it as like more of a Google for your apps. It'll allow us to search for, maybe you have a named action somewhere and you want to get access to that. Maybe you want to know where you referenced a certain hook or a variable, or even changing the wording out on something. So it'll kind of give you a search result of that. Probably the next Friday Live, we'll probably have some UI to show you on how that works. And then the one after that, we'll have a demo for that. All right. Let's see what else we have. We mentioned all of these ones here. Okay, I think that covers most of our new features and things that are being released. We're always looking for ideas, and we really do appreciate your feedback. When you do submit a feature request or an idea, we'll usually acknowledge that we've added that to our feature request stack. And then we take those and we sort of triage those. And we say, okay, this is a really useful feature. Or quite often we supply the features ourselves, and we realize that, as we're a pretty high touch company. So we realize that, you're having problems with something, and, how can we make that better for you? Okay, I think we can move on to our feature today, unless anybody has any questions so far. All right. One of the things I wanted to talk about is how we go about the process of building apps. And we sort of follow two processes. The first process is if we're just helping somebody to build an app and it's just kind of a quick thing, either we're doing it as part of your onboarding, or we are doing something just internal. And then the second process is more fleshed out. And this is when, from a consulting point of view, one of the biggest things that I see a lot of our clientele, a lot of developers do, is they just want to start building. And I think that's a really big mistake. They want to start just putting stuff on the page and just start, okay, I want to, they want basically all the UI, the fun stuff, but they don't want to think about really how the interaction is. So I want to show you an example of a project that was built out. And this project was eventually built out, and I want to show you the 3 stages of it. And as I pull this up, maybe Pearson and Andrew, you can probably pull up. Actually, Andrew, you won't be able to pull up the live one, I don't think, for this one here, because it's shut off now. But this was a registration application. And what we did here, and this looks kind of a little bit more fleshed out, but this is an example of kind of the early stages of understanding what an app does. We usually start with the concept of stories. And we say, well, what is it you're trying to do in the app? What are you trying to accomplish? What is the user doing? And if you think about a user story, it's quite often, maybe we were just talking before the meeting here about how can we track people who come to our Friday Lives. So let's say we're going to build an app for that. So the user story for something like that would be a promoter or a host wants to know what users are registered for an event. And that is a very vague kind of statement, instead of saying, oh, I need to know this field and that field and all of these fields. And let's just keep it really vague as long as possible. And that's what this app does. This app was a registration app for a recruiting process. And we started off really simple by just saying, okay, this is what we want to do. Don't even put any UI in at first. Just basically the story goes in the box, and then the next story goes maybe in another box, and so on. And then we start to flesh this out a little bit more. Now, this is not something that we would use to build from. This is not a design that we would use to actually build something from. This is something that I do when I'm talking to a client, to sort of further understand what their use case is. And because most of our clients are developers, they can easily sort of understand what's going on here, and they can see, okay, well, I notice you have this, decision box here and that decision box, and that's a little bit wrong for our business logic. That helps us really nail down what the use case is and how everything is going to work right from the get-go. Then later on, I start to add just a few fields. These aren't the right fields by any means, but it's just again, a very high level concept of what's happening in here. And as we do that, we flesh that out, and that helps us to give us a pretty good idea. And you can do the same thing. It starts to give you an idea of the scope of a project. Is this going to be a 30-hour project or a 300-hour project? Right. Sometimes if it's just a quick page, it's very quick, and sometimes if it's, as you start to discover these things, you realize a project becomes much more complex. For example, how are we going to generate this QR code? Right? Maybe we start to see some of these technical limitations and so on. So that's kind of our original process, or the starting of our personal process. Everybody has lots of ways of going about this. I'm not saying that we do this the best, but I personally find, as an engineer, I find this is really good for me to start to realize, are there any parts of this project that are really complex that I don't know how to solve maybe at the moment? Right. Then, Pearson, would you mind sharing your Figma for this? And maybe you can talk sort of about how you took this diagram here and fleshed this out. I'm not sure if you still have it up or.
Yeah, I can pull that up. 1 second.
So what we'll usually do is we'll use this as a very, very high level to be able to start to estimate, right? We don't have a design here. This is something a developer can work from, because it has proper business logic, but it's not something the UI person can do. So I'll share, we'll switch screens here and we'll take this to the next step.
Here, can everybody see this?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, so like Charles said, that first wireframe that he made with the client isn't what we're basing this design off of, but that's what I use to understand what are the key components that this client is looking for. So I'm going to kind of go through the history of my iteration process, because this project actually did have quite a few steps. So I know from Charles's wireframes, there was, just some pretty simple fields that had to be filled out. From what we saw from that very first meeting, we thought pretty simple, like just a few fields. They enter them, and then they maybe sign up for a membership, and that's it. And so when we showed this to the client, they were happy with it. But then as time goes on, they say, actually, no, we need this new feature, or we need this many new fields, and these fields need drop-down menus, and all those aspects come into play as you're building this out, and you're realizing, like, oh, maybe this design doesn't suit the needs of the product anymore. So I have just a bunch of different iterations. At the very end, we found out, oh, we need this sign-up process actually will lead the user to their pass that they're going to use to scan. So they need to have a scannable QR code at the end. And we found out that there's actually 2 different types of people who might be coming to this event, an attendee or an exhibitor, and both of those different types of users will have different experiences during the sign-up process. So now we have to have a different version of this screen for each of those users. Moving on, we're finding out, there's actually a bunch of required fields and some optional fields, and we need a lot more information. All of this information can't be put onto one screen because that's too much at once. Maybe we have to split this up into multiple screens, multiple steps in the sign-up process. And so now we have this page where you continue, and you can go to the previous page, separating these pages by personal information and experience information from that individual. Moving on, just some screenshots of more fields that we need, and eventually it turns into something more and more complicated. So you can see from a zoomed out view, it started off with just these 5 screens, and now we have this many just different varieties of screens for this product.
So Pearson, I noticed you always usually keep all of the old iterations. Do you tend to go back to those, or are they, like, how do you use those? Because I've always just kind of scrap things and just kind of redraw stuff.
Yeah, I personally like to keep old iterations, because I know sometimes when I'm designing, my mind kind of wanders in a linear direction sometimes, and I'll keep building and building upon a single idea. And it's good to just go backwards in time sometimes, just to see your process and what's changed, and that helps you identify maybe certain issues that you're trying to work around. or just looking back at your old ideas, maybe there's something that you got rid of that you realize now might have been a good idea that you want to bring back. So I like to keep all of my drafts just so that I don't lose any of the previous ideas I had, because maybe it didn't work in that situation, but maybe I can transfer it over to a new revelation we've had about the product, or even just something like a new client that comes to us. Maybe one of my old ideas from a previous project will apply
Right.
to this new one. So I just like to
Right.
keep
So you can reuse that creativity. That's actually a really good idea. Being able to look at that. And I think this is these iterative steps really, if you can solve all of these problems here, especially the business logic things, the stuff that's missing potentially, if you can solve it here, it saves so much more time in development. And of course, if you're consulting like some of the dev houses who are on the call here, you guys know that, you know, feature creep is a killer, right? So this really helps to minimize that. You can get sign off on all of these pages. And even if you don't document every little aspect of the workflow, you can kind of tell that, you know, these fields are what are required. So that means you have to have that in the database and so on. We'd like to show you the finished app, but unfortunately it's offline right now. So I don't think we can demo that, but it would have been.
I can probably.
Pardon me?
I can do some magic and get that working quickly.
It's if you can easily, you can, but it'll give sort of an idea of this same kind of workflow. But it was kind of neat because this particular app was used to, you know, register. They registered several thousand attendees at an event, a recruiting event for the Army, I think it was. So, does anybody have any questions about any of the stuff that Pearson we talked about so far? Feel free to either put them in the chat or you can chime in. Pearson, where do you get inspiration for design from?
One of my favorite resources actually is called Dribble with 3 Bs. And so here, there's just tons of UI and design inspiration. So I'll usually go to what's popular. And so let's say maybe I'm looking for some kind of just a form template, or like what are other designers making when they're creating a form design. So I just look through here and I say, oh, okay, you know, this isn't the type of form that I'm looking for, but maybe there's some elements here that I like. Oh, so they have a drawer menu that comes out from the side, and they have all these different settings that are interesting to me, or I like how they've laid that out. Maybe I go, maybe I look here and I say, oh, okay, well, I like how they're using these tab options, this tab feature where it separates all of your information, so you're not just in this one endless infinite scrolling form. So just things like that. I'm not necessarily looking to find what I'm trying to make, but I'm kind of picking and choosing elements from each of these designs to influence how I make this new thing.
Right.
It kind of goes along with the saying, everything is a remix, everything is inspired by something else. So this is where I get a lot of that inspiration.
And we'll put that link, Dribble, in the notes as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dribble's good. Even Pinterest has like a big UI kind of section. If you look into there, or Behance, there's a ton of different websites that offer design inspiration, but this just happens to be the one that I go to the most.
I think having a really good app, good looking app, is so important if you're public facing. I mean, most of the apps that we build in FileMaker, well, virtually every app we build in FileMaker is used by somebody who's on your payroll. And as such, there's generally not too much pushback on the clunkiness of the app or the aesthetics of the app. But when almost every app that's used that you guys build in BetterForms is generally used by the public in some fashion, suppliers. Occasionally it's employers, but the majority of the users are clients or suppliers to your business. And as such, if your app looks really good, I mean, it's a big branding, it's a big representation of your own business.
I re-enabled the registration app.
Pardon me?
I re-enabled the AOC app.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go for it if you want to share that. So this will take you on to the next step, the build out.
Actually, we have a question from Hans in the chat. Can you use the design in HTML and CSS they made in Figma, or do you have to rebuild everything in BetterForms?
That's a great question. You technically can, but there are pros and cons to doing that. So let me just go on an aside here for just a quick second, and I'll just show you what some of the pros and cons are. Instead of using stuff like in just a random design, because a lot of those images that you shown weren't actual, say, HTML code. But what you can do is you can go to sites like Tailwind Components. And when you're in one of these types of sites, let's say you see something that's really interesting. Let's go to cards tabs. I don't know what to see, all components. I'll go here. I'm gonna see if I can find something. So you find some pricing page like this one here. Actually, it's not a pricing page. This one's some logo here. Let's see something that works. Oh, sorry, my bad. I think this was a marketing site off of here. Some of these here they've changed the way this site works now, and some of the items that are on the site are links to other pages. So let's say I found just some random thing here, right? And I want to emulate this in BetterForms, right? And I find it, and I don't even know what it's doing. It looks like it's some kind of preview thing. I think it's kind of ugly, actually. But let's say I wanted to emulate this. These are crowd submitted, so sometimes the code is not the greatest. But what I can do in BetterForms is I'm just gonna create an HTML element, HTML block, and I'll just do this really quick, just because I haven't had a chance to live code today. So, all right. So we go into I've added an HTML block here, and what I'm going to do is copy this. And hopefully there's no problems with it. Paste this in here. And there it is there. I hit save. I hit save again, and I'm just going to preview this. So what I've done is I've added this link to this code here, and it looks like their code is kind of doing some funny stuff here below the link of my page, but I can use that right away. This wasn't a greatest example, but I can use that data. Now, this would normally come from data from FileMaker. Those would be normally rows. We have a video in our library on using Vue.js. So how you would go about editing these little blocks to make them reactive to your data that's coming in from FileMaker. And so some stuff like that, really, really easy to convert. Other things where it comes to like the input fields, so if you go to these input fields, you lose a lot of stuff. If I search for forms, maybe they have some forms, I'm not sure. Let's see, inputs. Let's see if this is one of them. So here's something like this. I can technically use this right out of the box like this, right? I can take this and I can go over to here, usually paste this in, and there it is. Right now, I can wire this stuff all up right into your FileMaker fields, right, that are coming from your JSON object, and we can use that. Where we lose out on, these are the cons, is we lose out on validation, right? That's the biggest one. So validation is generally kind of a tricky thing in web apps. It's a more complex type of piece of code that has to look at all of these fields. BetterForms is flexible enough you can use third-party validation libraries, or if you use the BetterForm fields for these, then it has all of that stuff built into it. So we generally tend to build apps that are a hybrid of more complex HTML so we can get that pixel precision. But at the same time, when it comes to input fields and stuff, try to generally lean towards BetterForms fields. You can still style these boxes up and you can make them look the same. using some additional classes. And I think, I thought I saw Christina jump on a call. She, I think, talked about a previous Friday Live about how to style these up. And maybe that's something that we can add for a future topic. So that's a great question. I'll switch over back to Andrew now.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I'm going to be showing the AOSA sign-up portal. And as you can see on the Figma here, I wanted to talk about something called responsive design, where if you looked at the Figma, Pearson, when he designs certain apps, if the user story is most users would be using a mobile device, he would generally design with mobile first. But you also have to take into account that someone can also use this app on a desktop device. So when designing the app, you need to make sure it looks good on both mobile and desktop. And sometimes Pearson, such as over here, will kind of have two different versions, one mobile and then one desktop. In this case, it's mostly just the mobile layout with kind of some padding on the side to make it look like the fields are a bit smaller. So this is the AOSA sign-up portal. It's currently offline, so I can go in here and just put some test data. And then it sends you to some COVID acknowledgement, some sign up. You can go in here, fill in some fields. Looks like this has been broken since. Actually, it's not going to work, huh? Okay, well, unfortunately, the app is offline, so some of the data we're pulling is not available. But yeah, so you can see here how we have a mobile design here, but also if you have a mobile device and you kind of make the field smaller, it'll still kind of adapt to the size of the screen, which is something to take into account if you expect your users to be on both a desktop or mobile device.
Andrew, that header at the top, is that using a slot?
That's a good question.
Or is that just part of the page?
I'm not exactly sure. Could I tell from HTML? Oh yeah, no, it's using HTML rather than the header.
Right. So actually, so one of the things, if you're ever trying to build these kinds of wizard type apps, one of the features that we don't really talk about a lot, excuse me, is the usage of slots. So slots are like predefined areas within your app that you can inject HTML code, and depending where they are, they're persistent in different parts. If you've ever used the BetterForms editor, we actually use a lot of slots. The whole subbar with the breadcrumbs are taking advantage of slots, and even the sidebar where it says pages and styling and things like that, that's actually a slot in the app. And I think maybe what we'll do is we'll have Hassan later on. He can, when he's ready there, he can show us how you can take advantage of those yourself for building common elements that will persist from page to page.
Charles, you don't use wizards anymore, right?
No, we moved away from those because they were really, to be honest with you, they were the very, very first element in BetterForms. They actually came before the whole page, and they have a lot of opinion in design. But I'm going to show you some techniques a little later on that you can make your own wizards really, really easy. And in fact, I think it's actually a little bit easier for some things. We'll talk about some techniques for preserving state as you move from page to page and so on.
Yeah, I'll also be ready to show that whenever.
Yeah, okay, you can go. May as well go next.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay. So over here, once you get started, you're in your FM BetterForms. So you just make your way over to the navigation tab, the styling tab. And then you just hop over into slots over here. And then over here, you can add headers or multiple other things as well. So over here, you open up, select the position you want. So over here, where I went with my example, I made a form header. And then all you do here is put in some HTML. It's not too much. And I put in the image of what I want, made my HTML. And then when I go to view it, so now I have this on every single page. And then I'll just walk through this. So now this header will be consistent throughout every page on my app that I made. And it's a nice and easy way to insert a header.
You can find the locations for all of those slots in our docs.fmbetterforms.com as well. All right. Depending on where the slots are sitting, determines how they function. There's slots that go right above the a page, below the page, above the app, below the app, and so on. So even just on this page that Hassan's on right now, this whole area, believe it or not, is a slot here, and this is a slot here in the app, and that's how this app is built. So they're really, really flexible. It just comes down to what you can conceive. And again, we're talking about a bunch of topics. We're not going to get into the real details, but maybe what we can do is save a special workshop or a Friday Live just for looking at any of these topics that you may be interested in. So thanks, Hassan.
No problem.
Another common thing that we've been really focusing on with the apps that we build lately has been two things, actually. The first one is how we structure our code. And I want to just touch base on that because we try to build things with the intention of anybody on the team can jump into something. And so far we've been pretty successful. We've talked in the past about API first design. I'm just going to share my screen here again. I can find my Zoom. We've talked in the past about API first design, and basically the main concept of API first design is that you structure your code in such a fashion that each chunk of code, in other words, in FileMaker, it's each script serves really one purpose, right? That script maybe makes a curl request, right? An HTTP call, and that's all it does. It doesn't care what it's sending. It doesn't care who it talks to. It only makes the call. And another layer up from that, if you think about it in layers, another layer up from that would be something that generates and sends one email. So it sends one email, it formats the stuff for the email. It says, this is the address, and this is a service I want to use. And then it calls that curl request script. Above that might be something that sends bulk email. So it calls the single email routine, but it iterates over the top. So we have this architecture of code. We actually, in one of our in our Friday Lives, you can actually find, we have something on API first design in here. I think there's a recording. If not, if you go to YouTube and search FileMaker API first design, there's a few talks I've given that are recorded there, and that gives you a really good insight on that kind of code structure. So how we use that with BetterForms apps is we do a few things. This is just a little demo database, but it just gives you may not actually realize, but you're kind of doing some of this stuff already. One of the things to really build clean apps is to have reasonably clean code so that you can come back and you can maintain it and somebody else can maintain it. We found that we can take even somebody who's relatively new into our team, like Hassan's one of our newest people in our team, and he's already making significant changes in like deeper levels of our code without having a ton of FileMaker experience and without even knowing the code stack. And the reason for that is because the chunk of code does one little thing. So you don't have to learn everything. You only have to understand that one little bit does. We try to separate the code into two halves as well. And if you think about the halves, I'm just going to draw on my screen here. If you think that at the halves, there's stuff that's kind of UI level, and there's stuff that's API level, or we'll call it internal level. So anything in this area here, we think of it as being UI related, and it also has access to all of the global variables that BetterForms uses, like the user object and the model and the app model and so on. Anything down here, all the communication here is all done with JSON. So everything, all the scripts that are run here are all have JSON in and out. And by doing that, it allows you to really reuse your code a lot. And I'll just show you here for an example. So I have a utility hook job application, and inside it has a form request and a utility here. And quite often we'll break down this utility into subcodes. So we usually put our code that's related to the extra buttons and extra functions that this utility hook would have. We usually put that UI code inside this supporting scripts folder, right? And that's it. Anything else that is not directly related to this page gets thrown into another folder, and we usually call that folder internal or app or APIs. And in this case, I have one in here called APIs. And I throw the stuff into here, and under the category or the entity of it is, maybe it's to do with contacts, or maybe it's to do with invoices and so on. And I really, really try to focus on keeping that code separate. Everybody already has their ways of doing things in FileMaker, and they're not wrong by any means. So I'm not saying to change these, but if you do want to be able to have your team grow and have other people actively work on the code with equal proficiency, you have to pretty much do that. Even big dev houses usually have the same developers working on the same piece of code, maybe 1 or 2 people on that team for that project, and that's it, right? With us, we have maybe 5, 6 people who are actively working on chunks of code and fairly deep in the stack. So I know this mechanism works really, really well. Again, if you want to learn more about API first design, there's a YouTube video for that as well. And let's jump back into here. The other thing I wanted to show you is a lot of times in our apps, we tend to, because they're public facing, we prefer to use, for the handling of images and container data, we prefer to use S3. It works really, really well. And Andrew's going to show us, basically give us a quick overview on how easy that is. And we'll point you to some resources as well.
I'm going to show kind of 2 examples, one on a very simple use case, and then one that on a project that we're working on right now that uses kind of multiple different uploads. But am I sharing my screen here?
Yeah.
Is it the right one? Because I have 2 monitors.
Editor.
Good. So this is an example that is currently public already, and I will be showcasing kind of how it works. So this is an example that uses UPI. There's other ways to use Amazon S3. Amazon S3 is just a spot to save kind of files on the cloud, and it's super easy to integrate into your app. For example, let's say you wanted to drop an image into the upload here. I have a little test image here, and if you click on upload, you can see how it uploads successfully. And then you can even preview it by pressing this, and it'll pull up the image. So on a very simple level, you can take a look at this example, and I'll kind of step through a little bit on how to integrate it. First of all, you need to go to your on form load and kind of instantiate the UPI instance. There's a lot of stuff in here, but more importantly, you can kind of have targets for where you want your dashboard to be, where you want your drag and drop area to be. And kind of what you want to do once the file is uploaded. And in our case, we kind of run a named action that calls a utility hook that goes to the backend, uploads the file, etc. But this is where you would be able to configure your upload and kind of run an action once the upload is complete. So this example exists already on the examples. If you go to help and click on examples and demos, you can check that out. On a higher level example, I will be showcasing an app called Signatures that I've been working on recently that uses UPI, but in a way that requires kind of multiple UPI instances. Because let's say you're uploading a resume or uploading an art statement and production process, you need some kind of a way to differentiate which location it was uploaded to. So let me try to upload a file here. You can see uploads the file. And if I look into my dev tools here, you can see how it uploads specifically to the application resume and has a type here. And this is something you can catch on the back end to kind of handle differently in your documents table.
So Andrew, if I'm following you correct, basically this application, which is for an event registration, they require various documents. Sometimes some areas it's one document, in other areas it's multiple documents.
Correct. So in this scenario, this one requires one document, but if you take a look at my kind of data model here, you notice how some of the application files is an array. So this one and specifically the workspace require multiple, and I'll kind of showcase how that works compared to only one upload. Other things you can do from here is preview the file, and you can also call it delete. And this, technically what I did there was a different S3 call per action. For example, when I'm uploading a file, this is an upload to S3 using their API. When I'm trying to preview the file, I'm doing a get request. And when I'm deleting, I'm doing a delete request. So Amazon has multiple different API methods that you can use to handle your files. If you go over to the product tab here, notice how there are more areas to upload files. For example, the portfolio. And here you can actually just select a whole bunch. And it will all upload and pop up like that.
Nice.
But for something like the gallery image, this can only take one file. So if I go here and try to upload multiple, it won't let me. It won't let me do one file. So if I go here and upload one, it'll upload and it won't let me upload anymore. So this is useful because if you have kind of different use cases for your API, you can configure them differently depending on what kind of upload you're running there. I think that covers most of S3. And it kind of, it's a very surface level on kind of what's possible rather than going through the details on how it works and such. But definitely give this a look if you're looking into a file uploading service.
If you've never used S3 before, here's kind of an overview of what's happening. We have our web page right here, and we have this module called API, and this is just a open source file widget that allows you to do some things, so we don't have to code much. And you have your FileMaker database sitting back over here, FMS, and AWS is sort of sitting over here as a cloud. And AWS, in order to upload files, you need to have some private credentials because you don't want anybody to just dump a bunch of garbage onto your bucket. All right. So the file folders are called buckets on AWS. And to put something onto that bucket, you need basically a signed URL, a special URL that has a passget token key that allows you to upload. So what this device does, as soon as you drop a file onto API, it calls FileMaker and it says, I have a file. FileMaker says, oh, you're user Joe Smith. I'm going to put it under a folder in Joe Smith. So I'm going to create a path. I'm going to create a file name, a URL with a path structure, and I can structure that path any way I want. It will generate that URL plus the signature using a custom function that was developed by Jason Wood in our community. He may be on a call today. So it is, and it's really one very simple. It's just a simple custom function plus a script, maybe 6 lines or so. Then that returns automatically. Right, it returns automatically back to here. So this is a utility hook that's running right in there. Then API can directly upload to AWS. Now, why do you want to directly upload to AWS? Is because you can upload fast. You saw Andrew just dropped like a ton of images, and like within a second or two, they're all uploaded. Right, super fast upload bandwidth and super durable storage there. Right, and it's not harder. Like a lot of people think, oh, it's an AWS integration, because back in the day, somebody created a FileMaker AWS integration and they had a ton of scripting, but it's not necessary. It's literally one HTTP request script is how we do it. And we use one get URL custom function and one script that wraps around that. And that's it. And then we generally keep in a we'll have over on the FileMaker side over here, we'll have a documents table, and you can structure this any way you want, but a documents table. And in that documents table, there'll be an ID And that ID usually references a file path that's over here, or it's computable to a file path of the document. There's all kinds of things you can do. We've built all kinds of really, really neat stuff. For one client, we built a URL shortener because they have a short URL and they don't like this big, long AWS string. So as soon as you hit the URL, it uses a BetterForms API that redirects the image to the file bucket, and it generates a signature on the fly so they can access that private file, and it just works. And so there's some really, really neat things you can do there.
David has a question there.
Yeah, question. I've had requests for adding a folder structure. So what would be the easiest way to do that?
That's a great question. What we've done, and we find that works pretty good, is at some point in time, you're going to need to manually go in there and figure stuff out, right? Just like there's no database that we've never gone into the raw tables and did a find and moved some IDs around and stuff, because that's just what you have to do with the maintenance of data. So in order to make it readable in AWS, we usually structure the file path system based on a few different things. So for example, you might have the organization is the first part. So this is, we usually create our UUIDs with a prefix. I stole that idea I learned from Steve Winter. By creating a prefix, it'll be something like org and then some big UUID. And that'll be the folder. And then within that organization, maybe I have, if it's a multi-tenant application, I might have a tenant. So that's the client of the organization. So there might be a person or something like that. So we call it PER _ and then some ID that goes across here. And then, these are paths, right? And then finally the document, and we don't store the document by the document name. And the reason we don't do that generally is because names can collide, right? And with AWS, if you store one with the same name, you'll potentially overwrite the first one. So this will be something like doc, and then _ and then the ID for the document. This is, sorry, I can't write very well with my mouse. And we do preserve the file extension, because then at least you can read the file back and display it into things like these images here.
So no, that's fine. I'm doing that now. The request became more of a, oh, I want to create my own folder structure, right? So like if you went into Dropbox and they said, okay, we start with this folder, let's do sales reps and support people and customer service, and then inside each of those folders they add in, let's say by A to D, E to whatever, and then it's like literally they want to define the folder structure versus redefining it, right?
So if they want to define it, that implies that they have some UI that they're doing something with?
No, it's more because they're used to sort of like, if you went into Dropbox, you can actually do that yourself, right? Like if you went into a Dropbox scenario, right, you can create a folder, and then within that folder you can create a subfolder, and then within that you could do that, right?
Sure. So AWS, you can definitely create folders on the fly, and there can be totally dynamic in the sense of you create that path from that string when you put the file there. When you push the asset up, you define where it's going to go. But it sounds like you really need some UI on the front end or somewhere to give the developer or the user some kind of structure. And if you build that in FileMaker, maybe it's some kind of self-relating table that has folders and things like that or whatever, but you can still compute that same file path. So you would still be, everything would be exactly the same. It's just the part when you get the signed URL to post the item up there to the cloud, at that point you would be computing where it's going to go.
Yeah, I have a bit of a different philosophy on this. Dropbox is actually based on S3. And I think the chances that Dropbox is putting things in S3 using the file structure that you give it is 0. They're putting that in a database somewhere. And then in S3, it's just UUID / file name or something like that. That's what I do. Because you don't have users who are logging into AWS to view the files.
No, but
if you keep track of all this in your database, then you can move files without actually moving them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're keeping the file structure, the overall structure, abstracted from the physical structure, which is
Right.
totally fine if you are going to do the maintenance in FileMaker. But if you need to do the maintenance in AWS for some reason, maybe you got orphaned records or something like that, that's the only reason why I suggested using file structure in have the actual folder structure within AWS. So it's kind of pros and cons. It means you can never maintain those fields or those files outside of having the database. If you ever lose the database, the files are gone, right? So you have to say, okay, well, what can potentially happen? What can go wrong too?
Right.
Okay, so Jason,
right.
you're basically saying just use the one ID, hook it in the S3, and it never changes, and then that you mimic the structure in FileMaker for the user.
Right.
Which-
The structure becomes data in your record that
Right.
that is represents the object. Yeah, and then the other thing that means is that you can preserve the original file names in S3 because it's just UUID / and then there's one file in there.
Yeah,
And when you download from S3, it'll come down with the file name that it went up with.
okay. Yeah, that's probably easier actually because then they can define any structure they want.
But Charles is right. It would be an absolute disaster if you ever lost your database. But of course, it would be a disaster if you lost your database
Regardless.
Oh, no, I only have one copy of it. I have no backups either, right? So
Yeah, well, you know, it's and you work on that live, of course. So, all right, we'll keep moving along. But this is if we want to talk more about AWS, let us know in the comments there, and we can have an entire dedicated Friday Live to that. Jason's done a number of presentations, I think, in the past on basically integrating API within FileMaker, and we're just using it in BetterForms here, but it's the same type of an idea. Once you start using AWS, you'll never look back, right? Jason, would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I don't use containers. I would only use a container for really not for storing files, but some other like sort of hacky things I might still.
Yeah, transitional ephemeral type of things where you just need a file to do something with, get the size of it or something like that. They're useful for that.
Yeah, random things. I'll just post a link to the blog post that I did about S3, and there's also a link to a SOFA presentation.
Super, thank you. All right, we'll continue on here. Andrew, did you want to talk about the next item?
Yeah, sure. So I want to talk about kind of page structure and style classes bodies and style classes page. And I noticed when I work with a lot of our users that they don't utilize this too often, and mostly because our templates are a bit outdated and kind of use an old page structure. So Charles created this diagram here, which we can link in the chat, but it's kind of a diagram on how a BetterForms page is laid out using the form blank form type. I don't know if you've ever seen the form types up here, but here there's a few different options here, but I think 99% of the time you want to be on form blank. There are other ones like form plain and form wizard, but those are a bit of legacy support. Generally, your page wants to be on form blank, and what that does, it allows you to utilize these two keys here. One called style classes body, and the other is style classes page. And if you look at the page structure that Charles created, you can kind of see how the page is laid out. You have your page, which is essentially the whole outer green one. You have your body, which is kind of the middle section, and then you have your field and your groups inside of that. So what I've done here is create a kind of example page that you can take a look at. Give me a second. My tab is broken here. So if you go over to, okay, my Chrome seems to be not happy with me right now, but I think this is the problem Hassan was running into earlier. But I've created a test page in my test app that will highlight those differences in page body, groups and then also the fields inside of that group. So you can see here,
Oh, that's cool.
in my page, I have it as red. In my body, essentially what I'm doing is the body kind of becomes the page by taking up the whole width and size of the page. So you see the red on the outside here. Within the page builder, I have blue on the group. So if you look at the page structure, the group is kind of the outside of the fields, and then inside the fields you have your fields, which is the style classes. So my group is blue, and then my style classes each is green. So you can kind of see the structure here. You have your outside page / body. Inside each body, you have the groups, which is the blue ones. And then inside each blue group, you have your fields, which is the green. And a lot of people have questions of how do I kind of color different sections on my page. And this is a good way to do it. You see how I have padding on my groups here. If you take off the padding, and even on the body here, you can kind of see how the blue section is a bit more, well, I have some margin, or I have some more padding on the fields right here. There you go. And you see how the blue is now kind of touching each other. So this is a good way to kind of color different sections of your app using group stylings. And then you can have maybe like a white section on the top, and then you have a blue section on the bottom. This is quite useful, and it's a good way to style using groups. And then in the middle of your groups, you can style as usual. That kind of covers the basics of that. Charles, do you have anything else to add?
No, there's a link to this whimsical. If you search the forum on page structure, there's a link in there, and we'll put one in the. We also have a link in the show notes as well.
I'll share it in the chat there. The next topic I wanted to share was BF utility functions, and I've also created a test page for this. And these are stuff that even I didn't know exist until recently. But there's a lot of different functions you can use in your app. And let me kind of fix this slug here. These are essentially JavaScript functions that you can call in the button using a function, or in your on app load, on form load. The one called bf.getQueryParam is a pretty simple one. You already do this in FileMaker on your on-form request by grabbing the query out of the $bf query, but you can also do it on the front end, and that comes in handy sometimes. For example, if I have an ID of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can just pull it right from the URL. The second one, a UID, this comes handy sometimes, and I'll show an example with kind of an invoice example I've made. But let's say you needed to generate a UUID from the front end and then pass it to the back end for some logic. We have that function here. There are other ways to do it. If you go online and search generate UUID, and Stack Overflow will give you a million results, but here it's pretty useful. You can also set it to uppercase if that is better. BF Actions Clear is a very powerful one. Essentially, it allows you to stop a set of actions depending on some kind of Boolean. In this case, that's what I'm doing. So you see how this button sends you a little alert. If I set a Boolean called stop actions to true, this button no longer works. So you can kind of handle actions based off some kind of logic. So maybe you want to stop a certain action from running. This is a good way to do it. There's some other ways to do it, but I find this to be one of the easiest ways to do that. And finally, BF named action is probably the one I use the most out of all of these utility functions. It's a way to call named actions from JavaScript. And as a caveat, you need to be on the BF staging base code to utilize some of these utility functions, because some of them are newer and they only came out in the recent base code. So I would definitely recommend upgrading to the BF staging base code if you have not. Charles, if I'm correct, there's very little chance of breaking anything by upgrading to BF staging.
Correct.
So definitely give that a try. And what BF named action does is, if you see here, I'm just sending a alert in my named action. So named action send alert, sends an alert. There you go. You can call whatever named action you want from JavaScript, and this allows you to do some conditional logic and that.
I think that last one is really powerful, because you know, like our team, I guess we could say we speak BetterForms first, if you will, in the sense of like we can code everything fine, very comfortable in JavaScript, but there are certain things that are just easier to use BetterForms action processor engine. It's just way easier than to do it in JavaScript because it's effectively wrapped. And quite often you're using a third-party library. I just did this the other day with a library for, actually it was for Uppy, but it was to work to basically make BetterForms apps work offline. And I needed to add a callback to that library. And normally to do that and to interface that callback to some kind of communication with FileMaker or communication with some other part of the app can be quite tricky. And if Google JavaScript callback hell kind of thing, you can kind of get an idea of that. And basically, so dealing with these callbacks can be tricky, but by putting something like BF named action as the callback, now I can use that to run some other chunk of code, which makes it really, really easy. We have some other BF, actually all of the BF functions are documented in our docs as well.
Yep, if you search up utility functions, you will see a lot here. I kind of highlighted the ones that are used most often, but there's some other ones that include sockets, some error throwing and catching. But most of the time you'll be using actions clear and these two on the bottom, and then most used one is BF named action. Definitely recommend taking advantage of that and being up the new base code. Lastly, I will quickly showcase this one because while I'm already sharing my screen, model filter keys is something that I think most people are already using. But the idea behind model filter keys is if you had a bunch of data in your model, in this case I don't, I just have a few fields, and you only want to send a certain key or certain keys to your hook when you run it, you have the ability to, by running a oh, where'd I put it? Here it is. Model filter keys. Essentially, it's an array of keys you can add, and when you run the hook, only that key will be sent through your hook. So, for example, I only have markets being sent in model filter keys, and when I press run hook, and I go check on the hook that I should have open somewhere. Here it is. You can see that only markets got sent to through the hook, and this is super useful when you want to limit the payload sending going back and forth between the front end and FileMaker, because some people can have thousands, tens of thousands lines in their model, and that can really muddle up response times. So if you have that scenario, definitely take a look at model filter keys, and I think you can also find it in the docs. If the docs wants to respond.
I always forget if it's a capital filter or I literally have to look this up once a week.
There you go. So take a look at that if you have a giant model and you need to send only a part of that data back.
Right, which kind of brings us into performance and and what we can do to increase performance or change performance of the way apps work. And we've been doing a lot of research in this area, and I want to show you some of the really interesting things that we're developing. These are stuff, they're going to be techniques that we can do in FileMaker right now, and with BetterForms, but where we can sort of take that. The biggest thing in terms of performance, there's sort of three main areas. There is the time in flight. So the time between a hook and the back end when BetterForms is talking to the back end, that's dictated not a little bit by the internet, but it's really dictated by your payload size, right? A bigger payload just takes longer. Some people are pushing 100K back and forth, and using something as simple as model filter keys, you can reduce that to just the element that you want. Then there's the processing in the back end, which is what's happening on FileMaker. What is it doing while you are running this hook? And we see this in our forum or in Slack all the time. There people are saying, well, it's timing out. Can you increase the timeout? And the timeout is set for 20 seconds. And if you're making your user wait longer than 20 seconds, you've already got a bigger problem, so to speak. So I want to talk about a few techniques here. And I am going to just open up, I'll share my desktop here. Oops. And there we go. All right. So just in dealing with performance issues. All right. All right. So there's a few, as we mentioned, there's a few sort of areas, if you think of FileMaker being here, and your app has to communicates up to FileMaker in some fashion, and that has to come back again, that round trip. So one of the things we want to do is reduce that payload. So how can you reduce the payload? Well, first of all, don't return like 10,000 records, return a finite number of records. And if the number of records is more than that, say 50 records if it's a type ahead search, tell the user. And you see this in these design patterns all over the web. It says plus, show another 50 records, or, refine your search to show less records. So there's those kinds of things. But there's other types of areas in the app that you can really optimize performance as well. So if you have a process, some type of slow process that's running in FileMaker here, one of the things to keep in mind is when you're running a script in FileMaker, it's running in the web publishing engine by default, right? But FileMaker has a whole other thread, if you will, a whole other engine, and we'll call it the server. I want to call it PSOS just for better engine here. So what's happening here is we can offload a lot of slower, heavy lifting into this thread and release the front end. So this way, when FileMaker, when a call comes in, you run something in the web publishing engine. The web publishing engine can call a perform script on server, but not return or not wait for return, right? So don't wait for return. And then the front end can release the call back, coming back over to the web app, right? So what some examples of that is, if you have a big application, I was actually on a call with somebody this morning. We were talking about this from optimization. If you have, I think it was this morning, maybe yesterday, if you have, say, they have this order page where they have people, and they're using this app, and they just keyboard entry, just data entry, and they're entering 200 to 300 records within about a 10-minute span. So they're just going boom, 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 boom. And then they have to submit that up to FileMaker. So now they got this, potentially FileMaker needs to create about 300 records on submission. And this happens at the end of a shift. So they have about 200 or 300 employees that are all doing this kind of crazy data entry at the end of some shift. I don't even know what the industry is, but that was the scenario. So what you do here is you don't actually try to create the records on the fly. You don't even create them in perform script on server, because even that, if you have hundreds of employees and they're creating, there's a potential of, several thousand records within the span of a few seconds to a few minutes. So that still is way too burdening on FileMaker. Instead, what you do is you create one record, and in that record, you have a data store. So it's just a generic text field, and you take the entire piece of information, which is already in a beautiful format JSON, and you save it in that field, and you mark that record as to be processed. And then you release the front end, and the front end is done. And then on a separate thread, you go through and you chunk away with all of these records that are to be processed, and you process them one at a time, because you don't actually have to create the records in real time. You can create them over the next 5 minutes, but you need to release the front end really, really quick. So that's a technique that we use a lot of times. And I want to show you another technique that we're really developing here. There's two things. So the next one for optimization in an app. Everybody knows we already have this thing called app model. Okay, I'm going to call it the app model, which is like a global data store, right? And then underneath underneath the app model on any given page, we have the page model, or we just call it model. I'll say page model. And this is kind of like local to the page. And that sort of sits on every one of these pages. So if I have page 1, I have this sitting here, and I have another page, and I have this data sitting here, right? We can control, we can set by, we can explicitly say which piece of data we want to refer to. If we say app dot first name, that would refer to this, and if we're referring to JavaScript, that is. And in the page model, by default, all of the form elements, all the BetterForms elements connect to the page model. So quite often I'm working on something and I may have a page, and we'll call this page contacts. And I'm just going high level here, but hopefully you understand the concept here, right? And I'll show you the real example in a second. And then I have another page called invoices, right? And I'm switching between the contacts and invoices and going back and forth all the time. So normally when this is happening, we're going to the server, and each time we're going to the server and we're grabbing the contacts. We're doing an on-form request. We grab all of the contacts and they get loaded in here. And that takes time, right? Because we have maybe 50 contacts. Even though we have a thin as JSON, it's not too big. It doesn't have all the deep object. And then this one is doing the same thing. So I want to introduce you to a design pattern. It's kind of like a top-down design pattern. And I want to evolve this into a little bit more complex one. Instead of loading in the on-form load for your page, instead of loading the page, instead of enabling on-form request, we actually turn on-form request off. Okay, so we're not going to the server when the page loads. Instead, what we're doing is we're having an action, and I'll build this out really quick in a second. And the action is basically going to look into the app model, and it's going to say, do I have the contacts list here? Right? And I don't have the contacts list, or I do have the contacts. Let me see if this will draw up. There it goes. Yeah. It says, do I have the contacts list here? If not, if I do, let me just show those right away. And it's instant because it's already saved in app. If not, I still probably need to go get the most recent contacts, but the user doesn't need to wait for that. So why don't I run a utility hook, and I'll call the utility hook, and I'll say, please load the contacts, but don't load them into app, don't load them into model, load them into app. So what that looks like in an actual app is I would do something like this. And this is on utility. I would do set variable. I'm just going to say $events because I happen to have a events object, and I would just like you normally would, we'd say get column as array. And this would be events as JSON, where the events is published is 1. Okay, so this is going to grab all events. Boom, boom. That's going to grab all the events. Now, normally what we would do is we would do something like set variable. Oops, sorry, too fast. There we go. Set variable. And this would be $BF model, and JSON set element. If you're not using the keystrokes, start using them. Learn one a week, right? You'll thank me for it. And events, and this is $events. Oops, this is $events, and
Are you just starting into app instead of model?
Yeah, I'm going to do that in a sec. I want to show you. I want to demonstrate both of them. JSON array. Okay. All right. So that's normally what you would do, right? So that data is going to return into the model. All you're doing now is, instead of doing this one, you're doing the same thing, but you're replacing it to this app, right? And this is a game changer here. And oops, too much. All right. So what this will do is exactly the same thing, but instead when the page loads, it will push that data into the app model. right? Now in the page, when the page loads, I have a page, right? Let me get rid of this for now, and we'll just put something like table here, and we'll put events, oops. And events. Okay. And we're going to turn off the, we're going to turn off the on-form request. So now what you do is over here, we have a, I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff here because this is from a prior demo. There we go. We have on-form load. In your on-form load, that is where you run your utility hook. And I'll build this out in a second. I know I'm missing a couple bits, right? So I just run my utility hook. I don't even need this in here. So I just run my utility hook because I only have one option. So that should, in theory, when the page loads, it would fetch the data, but it'll put it into app, right? But what I really want is I really want to add just one. This is the key part here. It's just a tiny bit of code, a JavaScript function that sits ahead of this. And this function, before the utility hook runs, it says model.events equals app.events. So now it'll start to pull the data for the page. The page will actually render, right? Because the page will start rendering because it has data right away. And then finally, I'm going to copy one more action down here after this hook. And in here, now we've just fetched the new data. That might have taken 2 or 3 seconds. And then basically we're doing the same thing here, but backwards. So we're basically storing that new data that we've, actually, we don't even need to do this because we're fetching the data. This is my bad, my mistake, because I changed the pattern here. So here, so now we've potentially, it's actually the same thing. So at first we grab the data from app, put it in the model. We run the hook is fetching new data. The new data goes into app, so we refresh the data on the page by pulling it back out when we're done. And that's it. That alone and turning off the utility hook will make your apps really, really snappy, right? Because you're no longer waiting for the data anymore, right? If you want to make it even more performant is, since I'm storing the data in app, now this is a security thing, so you always have to think about, is the user using public computer and all this kind of stuff, but you can save the data as well. So you can go over to our settings tab here, go into the app model, and I'm going to create a key called events, so that, and this is where my events would be. And now you'll notice something that's new here, and this is only available on BF staging, but this events here key will show up over here, and it says cache in browser, cache in tab. I'm going to click cache in tab there. And what that will do is now those events will actually persist through a refresh. All right. So what it'll do is it'll save that data to local storage. So the next time you come back to that page, even after a refresh, the data is still there. All right. So let's kind of see this in action in a little bit more blown out app. Actually, I can probably do it in here. Did I save? I just want to make sure I saved my work here. Yeah, no, I didn't. Okay, let me just add one more in here. Looks like I didn't save it there. Oops. Save. Okay, so that should do that. Run the utility hook, and let's just see if it will work proper. All right, so there's my data. Right now, if I'm gonna navigate to another page, I don't think I have contact detail. I think it's another page in my app. Maybe it's not.
/form.
We should fix that. Pardon me?
You did /form/slug.
Oh, did I? Okay. Well, at any rate, when I came back to this page, even if I do the refresh, the data's there instantly. Right? There's no on-form request hook here. Right? On-form request, on-form request hook is turned off. So if I navigate to another page, I do have other pages in my app. Let me just find one. Starter. I don't know what starter is. Let's try to starter. Here goes starter. So I navigate to starter. Now watch when I go back. Data's instantly there. In behind, Now this is very small data, but if it was massive, the data is being backfilled and it gets dumped into the page. So that's kind of the gist. That's the gist of those kinds of optimizations. So again, the core concept is that you're doing top, the data is coming in from the top and it's going down. And you're just caching it at different levels as you go up. The database is effectively a big cache, right? I want to show one other, let me see, how are we doing for time? 11:27 here. Let me just see what else we got. We have a lot of stuff here, folks. So if you have any specific things. Somebody asked, is this in FileMaker? Everything we've done is in FileMaker. That's a great question. Chris asked, is there a concern with the app model getting too large? Local storage is limited, I think, at 10 megabytes, which is pretty massive data. We were just talking about just yesterday, Eduardo and I were talking about other alternative mechanisms for storing data where you can store even more larger data and how we can maybe possibly incorporate that. Generally speaking, no, it's not too much of a concern. The browser will automatically prune out that data if you're not using it, because that's shared between I think apps on the same top level domain. I'm not positive on that though. But we haven't so far seen it as being a problem as far as size goes.
Why do you move the data from the app model to the model for the page? Why not just render it from the app model?
Oh, that's a great question. Really, really good question. You can do that with HTML elements, but the BetterForms elements by default don't reference the, first of all, it's fully compatible with what you got already. So it's like, all you have to do is literally, if you already have an existing page, normally you probably would have this stuff stuck in here, right? In your on-form request. So all you need to do to convert to using this kind of technology or architecture is go into here. You would do something like perform script, and then you would call that on-form request. So that's fully compatible, and then disable your disable your on-form request. Add those two functions that I did, and then your page is fully compatible. But these things here, this is referring to the app or the page model, not the app model. It would be interesting if we could say maybe app dot like that, and that might be something we can possibly look at. And then you wouldn't even have to do that. Yeah, you could maybe add another parameter in there that allows you to switch to the other to the app model. Sorry, I'm gonna close this up here. Yeah, that would be. I think that would be a great idea to be able to do that. I want to show you another mechanism now. So we talked about local caching, caching just in the app model that survives page changes. Then adding some cache to the local storage, which survives page refreshes or even closing the page. The next one is a little bit different, and somebody had asked us if we can talk a little bit about messaging and some of the things that you can do with that. And I want to show you some really I don't think I want to save this. I want to show you some really neat things that we can do with messaging and how we need to, where we're trying to go with some examples and things like that. Now, this isn't really new code in our base code or anything like that. Messaging has been out for maybe about 6 months, 5-6 months, but it's only used by a handful of developers. So I want to give you some ideas of where you can go here. If you're consistent with your naming conventions, we are hyper consistent. IDs are called ID only and nothing else, right? If you're consistent with your naming conventions across your tables, and you and every table or every piece of data, we'll call it an entity. Every entity has an ID. You can get some really, really cool gains from this. First of all, I just want to show you a little bit about an example. I think we have this in examples. I think I just created this the other day, and it's just a second. And it's called. So it's got a lot of pages here. So this is an example here where we could use optimization, right? Because now I had to wait about 4 seconds for this, for all of these, because there's 100 and something examples in this app to load. Messaging peer-to-peer anonymous channel. This is the one I wanted here. So basically what messaging does is it allows the user to, allows you to communicate. You can communicate in different methods between either between two. Oh, okay. This is built out a little bit more. That's cool. Either between two tabs or between FileMaker and any of the tabs. So if I open this up in another browser, and I'll even use Safari, for example, here, if it fires up on my old machine. We're still doing the bouncing. It's only 12 years old now, this computer, so I don't know what's wrong with it. It should still be going. Don't switch. Okay, so in this particular case, what's happening is these two pages are talking to the same, or talking on the same channel, if you will. Channels can be explicitly set. In this case, they're anonymous channels. That means you don't have to be logged in. They are, the communication is scoped to the domain that you're on. So I am using examples dev.fm BetterForms. So the communication is scoped there. And when I type in here, you can see the messages are showing up on the other side. Right? No FileMaker is involved in this. No records were created or anything like that. So what's happening is, and this is really, really easy feature to use, and it doesn't mean you want to build chat, but I'll show you why you want to do some things like that in a sec. So what happens with these messages peer-to-peer here is I have a very simple data model with a key called contact, and it's got a first name and a last name, and that's it. Over here, on my on-form load, I have a simple instruction here, and this might be a little hard to see. It's called channel join anonymous. This is in our docs, this information. I called it messages too for the name of the example. And it just joins that channel. And then what I did is over here, I created an on changed actions right here. So basically, whenever this key changes, whenever somebody types into it, I'm calling this named action called value changed. In value changed, I'm doing a couple of things. I'm adding a debounce because I don't need to send a message every second, but we don't necessarily need that. The network will appreciate you not flooding it with traffic though. So I call it debounce. It waits 600 seconds or 600 milliseconds for somebody to stop typing. And then I have another action. This is another new action called message send. And I'm passing it, in this case, I'm passing it the model. I'm sending the information I'm sending actually is an alert. So I'm actually sending the other tab an action. We use the actions, BetterForms actions engine to communicate. So we're sending the other tab an action, and I'm sending it to this channel. I can send it to multiple channels as well. And there's a thing called model. The model is what I'm actually passing along. So I'm sending this contact. This piece of code is just updating this to the current model of the page. That's all. And that's it. And then basically you can see here, and messaging is actually very, very low latency when you go tab to tab. If I was to reduce this to, let me just delete this for a second and hit save there. And if I do this here, just so we can see the time, actually I can just do it from this one here. There, this is, you can see the messages are going from between.
I mean, Pong is a good example of this.
Yeah, Andrew and Eduardo built a Pong game, and you know, classic 1979-ish Pong, and it basically works across browsers, and it's pretty neat. So the latency is reasonably low here. There's a number of different mechanisms that you can use channels for, though. Where we use it in the editor is, you've used this already a whole bunch of times. If I go to, let me switch back to, yeah. If you've ever deployed, and Let me just do this. This is so ginormous. And we'll go here again. If you've hit deploy, this is using messages on the server. It's exactly the same type of code, but I'm sending a message, and we'll have maybe a whole show dedicated to this, or at least a workshop on messaging. But I'm sending it to this particular tab because I know this tab, which tab requested this deployment. So when I hit deploy here, and I deploy to production, what's going to happen is there's a whole bunch of processes that have to happen in the back end, right? There's about maybe 5 or 6 different sub processes that have to happen. It's a lot of heavy lifting that has to occur in order for you to deploy. And it's kind of nice, kind of techie, nerdy that you want to know what's happening. So right now, it's actually really is. This is real time. The server is actually creating all of those messages and pushing them to the browser here when that happens. So that's a good example. And I'll show you another example of using messages. So any type of real-time process, if you have a report generation that takes a long time, don't make the user wait anymore. All you have to do is push something into the app model of what the status is of that report. And as long as you have something that monitors that, it'll automatically just work. So this is one other thing I wanted to show you what you can do with messages too. And this is using a new technique. And this is pretty cool. Let me just make sure I got the right one here. All right. So if let's see, I think characters, there we go. Okay. So I got characters here, and I'm going to open this up. Command tab, paste, enter, and close up this here. All right. So first of all, using that optimization mechanism, now when I switch to characters and I switch back and forth, even though we're grabbing a ton of data, it's instant because we've already got it saved. So that's one of the first things. The next thing that we're doing here is if I have to edit this character, this is character 1, Mabel. This has inline editing, and I go character 1A. When I click out of this field, if this is working still, you can see it just changed on this tab. Right now, this isn't using peer-to-peer messaging, right? But this is really powerful. Right? Crazy powerful. And this is a lot of work normally to build from a scratch for a web framework to do this kind of stuff. It's pretty complex. So basically what's happening, and it works both ways. If I go 1C, and let me see if I go here, there it goes. Yeah, I clicked out as soon as I changed browsers. So the data is live. So what's happening here is this change gets sent using model filter keys. We only send the piece of information that we need to change to the server. The server says, oh, somebody changed the character number. Well, this character has a unique ID, and here's the real key. The character has a unique ID in that object. And I have maybe this character number, but that's a public facing number. That's not an ID. So ID character Mabel, whatever that is, has changed. I don't care where it is on the network. I don't care what apps you're looking at. That piece of data changed. So what it does is it sends a message out to everybody who's connected to this particular Fried Eggs episode. All right. So that's only these 2 users right now. And in that message, it says, here is an ID of something, an object that's changed. I don't care where you're using it, how you're having your shape of your object, just update it. We wrote some special code, and eventually this will work its way. Once we feel confident enough, it'll work its way into the framework already for you. But you can just add it in manually if you want to do this kind of stuff right away. And it basically looks through your data model, and it finds that ID and it updates that piece of code. It doesn't matter where it is. And because BetterForms is built reactively, it just updates all the data on the front end. So what's really cool is you can do it in all different kinds of places within the app here as well. You can see this one doesn't have the script loaded, so it took a little longer to load. It looks like there's some responsiveness things going on there. And let me just see here. I think am I on the same one? Where's another here? Oh, here's another. This is the one I want. So here's another example of the same thing. This says drag and drop. So this is 1 and 5, and I want to change this. It should, there it goes. It just changed and pushed out to the other one. So this is awesome for building really collaborative apps. Right. So now you can start to build apps, especially if you have a software as a service, or you want to push something out that you want that data to be a little bit more live. You can do this really, really easy. believe it or not, there is no JavaScript required to do what I just did here. All right. There is to do the drag and drop. Yes, there's a library for that. But to push this data out from the back end, from the server, coming into this and to update this data, there was nothing involved. It's just pure FileMaker, and it's only 2 lines of code in FileMaker, and that's the beauty of it. It's literally only 2 lines to make the message, because Eduardo has already written the API to send a message. So all you have to do is call that script, and it sends the data out. So that's some new tech that we're playing with in terms of optimization. I'm not sure if anybody has any questions on any of that stuff.
I think Alessandro had a question.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Hey,
Hi.
how you doing?
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Okay. About these 2 techniques, the first one, you think that because I have a case that the name and the last name is not enough, and I need to put also a check about the phone number and email. You
Sure.
think that this generate a bigger JSON to put in the app to make the query
Yeah,
too
it's
big or
fine.
no?
It's still very small. Imagine a picture. Compare everything to a photo, right? We look at the data and say, oh, we're going to add an extra couple fields as if it's going to be too big. But to put that into perspective, that's going from maybe 100 bytes per row to, let's say, 200 bytes per row. You drop a photo in the browser, or somebody doesn't have an optimized thing, and that's megabytes of data.
No, but my question is about the system to make a query, not only name and last name, but make a query for, imagine 30,000 records. So you need to make a query in 30,000 records in the field name, 30,000 requests for the field last name, 30,000 records from the field number, and 30,000 requests from the field email.
Right. You wouldn't return all of that data though, right? Because there's no human that can process 90,000 pieces of records. So you'd really only return maybe the first 25 or 50.
Okay. And
right?
the second question is, in these pieces, is it possible if he find a record, send, it probably is possible with an API code on the phone number on an email, that if you put that, you enter your record, correct? So if I enter in my record, I use the second technique that you showed that load my information. And if I need to change only my telephone number, I already have loaded my information. I don't need to make a query on the server. And I can update very quickly my information and go through,
correct? Yes. Yeah, and that's what's happening here. There is a lot of data here on this page. This is an entire script as JSON, an entire movie script. So it's a lot of data. And I have this one highlight here, which is this one highlight here, right? So that's dynamically fetching the data from the server. And if I make a change over here, what I'm doing is I'm not sending that much. I try to send as little information as I'm going to put 0.5 for the quantity, and I save that. And you can see even before the modal is changed, this one's already received the data. So what we're doing is we're using this design pattern, which is another thing I wanted to just sort of mention. Maybe we'll finish off today and then we'll go to questions. I think a couple people raised their hands. Chris
and Neil.
Yeah, Charles, where's a good resource to learn more about messaging other than this video? Do you guys have any documents on it or other videos that you guys have done on it?
Yes, there are docs, and I would start with 2 things. Go to the example, the peer-to-peer messaging example that I showed you there. We don't have a server top-down architecture because this is something we sort of just used ourselves probably in the past month or so. So we don't have an example of that, but that's something that we could pretty easily add into our examples file. And if you haven't already, if you don't already know, we have a new examples file. It's available in our files download, and it is what the actual file is that is powering all of our examples that use backend code. So that would be a good spot there.
Just to add, we have a example in the example file for a progress bar. And that messages, and that's all hooked up in the example file, so you can take a look at that and how we integrate that.
Right. So that progress bar would does almost all of the stuff that we're doing here. Neil, you had a question?
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, I've probably just been answered with what you just said there. So the FileMaker side of things, that you've just mentioned, that's in the examples file with that progress bar.
For the progress bars, yes.
Great.
And of
Okay,
course, you
thanks.
can change that. So the progress bars are really easy because all they are is you have somewhere in your app model of your page, you'd probably put something like some kind of thing like progress, right? You have some kind of key that's called, and it might start off at 0. And you have somewhere in your page, you have some component that says if progress is greater than 1, then show a spinner, show a number, whatever you want to show. And that's it. That's all you have. And then on FileMaker, in your hook, part of the $BF state contains the ID or the client ID of this tab, this particular tab. Usually progress indicators are usually tab related, tab centric. And BetterForms automatically joins that channel. So there's already a reserved channel that's designed for every tab. All you do is you send the model key or your app key in this case with app.progress 10%. And you just send that out to this tab and that's it. And then the progress changes, your interface changes, everything is taken care of for you. So they're surprisingly simple. It's pretty much as elegant, I think, as it could be. In terms of interface.
Charles, can you speak again to how you target a specific tab? You said it's in the state, that tab ID is?
Yeah, it is actually. Andrew, do you have the examples file open to that progress bar by any chance? Do you want to jump to that and we'll show that? We can keep staying on this stuff because this
also might be worth clarifying that authenticated channels and anonymous channels are completely different.
Right. So while you pull out, I'll mention that. So there's a few different types of channels. There is anonymous channels. Those are ones that anybody can join within your app, but and you don't have to be authenticated. So that's usually designed for peer-to-peer things like games. If you're multiple developers, you'll see some other developers with avatars that shows that, such and such a person is editing the page or something like that, those kinds of things. Then there's authenticated ones, which are those are channels that are the user is joined to, and you know who that particular user is, so you can target just the user. So it doesn't matter what tab they are. You can say your report is ready in any of the tabs that they have open. They have multiple tabs. There are also a few different modes that FileMaker can act on. One of them is like a passive mode. Is a ignore mode, which that means that FileMaker will not listen to any of the tabs, any of the messages that are happening. That's really good for a real-time game. You don't need to create records when you move your Pong paddle. The next mode is a listening. It's kind of like a passive mode. And basically FileMaker is listening to those messages, but it's not interrupting the messages. It's just logging them. That's good for like Slack chat. And then the last mode is FileMaker is getting all the messages and the message doesn't make it to where you sent it. Nobody else on that channel gets it. FileMaker grabs, it's greedy with the message, and then you have to explicitly send that message back out. So that's kind of the gist there. All right. So basically, if you look at line 5 here, you can see set variable $BF state, and this is
let's take a step back.
I was just going to say this is running on server here.
Yep.
So this hook gets run, this start process gets run when you click the button to start. Maybe we can demo the actual app first.
Sure. The actual app, we have a button here, and all this button does is cause a named action called start process, and that named action just calls a utility hook. And you click on the start button, you can see how it kind of increments up. And this is all done on server, so if there's other things to do on the front end, it will still be interactable. And these messages come in through the app model, and then it gets updated by the progress bar. Yep. So once it's finished,
everybody's probably staring at that, watching it go across.
And once it's finished,
is that creating
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Record in the helper file more than one, or is it just one record?
No, messages don't create any. Only the utility hook for the start button created a
okay. Yep.
an entry.
So what the button did was call a utility hook. The utility hook essentially just runs a script on server. And the important thing to note is when it's run on server, it doesn't have access to some global variables that are usually available if you're running it locally. So on server, you'll for messages in particular, you need to pass in the $BF state variable, because the state is essentially what tells the FileMaker what tab is open. And then, yeah, Charles, you can pick it from here.
Yeah, no. Remember, when you run something on server, it's contextless, so you have to pass in a little bit of information. We lose all of those global variables there. All right. Actually, you can keep going, Andrew. You wrote this, so.
Okay. So in the script, all that's happening is we're grabbing the $BF state, and we're essentially just putting it back into the global variables, so we have access to essentially what tab was clicked on the front end. Another thing is the API key. Messages, in order to send a message to an app, you need the API key, and you can grab the API key for your app. I don't have it open here, but if you go to your org and open your app, you can click over here and copy API key. It's good to have this in your file somewhere. We have it in our preferences table, and we can just grab it from the preferences table using a get column, or I think we have a custom function that also grabs pref keys from the pref table.
And do guard your API key here. Treat it like your Stripe API key or any other API key, because it does give really powerful access into your users' apps. You can send actions into those apps and so on. So it is we do give you the ability to roll that key through the interface for that reason. It's shared amongst all of your environments as well. So you don't have to change from production to development, because messages are scoped to domain. So that's how you separate them anyway.
Mm-hmm. And just one quick here is, if you're using the action that Charles sent earlier, showed earlier, like the message send, of course we won't need your API key because it's just internal calls, but in this case, as it's doing an actual HTTP request and sending pretty much as like a curl command, or if you're using a Postman, for example, then that's why you need the API key here.
Right.
That makes sense.
So what I'm doing here is this is just a loop that kind of simulates a long process. I have a wait somewhere in here. Where to put it? Right here. That's a wait for 1 second. I just wanted to simulate a long process, and all this script loop is doing, it's just incrementing this count by 5 each time, and then setting the variable message as that count. Or actually, no, the message is the step it's on. The count is what sets as the number. So we increase the count by 5 increments each loop, and then we create an object for the message. And this object is pretty specific, and you can find an example of how the object should look like in our docs. So we just search messages. Right here, right here is essentially how your parameter should look when you're sending it into the HTTP request. Actually, yeah. So we have an API send message, and this script should be available on our latest helper file, I believe.
Yep.
Actually, we actually have it in our helper file, but we moved it over to our business file.
Yeah, we usually, instead of calling it from the helper file, the only problem with calling scripts from across files is you have the external data source and the reference, and that's potential point of breakage. So for this particular script, we just copied it locally into the actual file.
So in this line, we kind of just build that object that I just showed you here. You can also send actions, which is very useful if you do trigger an action right when the message finishes. But we just built the object here. Notice here we're passing stuff like the channel, and the channel just ends up being the tab that we were on. We got that from the BF state. We send the API key. The domain that we're sending to also can grab from the BF state. And then just a few things like want to update the progress, of course. So that's the count. I want to update the message, and that's kind of the step 1, step 2 thing that I showed earlier. my actions array is empty, but this is where you would send any JavaScript actions. Actually, no, it's BetterForms actions you send in here.
Yeah, you could send like run this named action when the other end receives the message, for example.
So once I built that object, I just call the API send message script, passing in the object that was created. In this case, looks like I'm not even passing an object. I just copied it over, which is interesting. And then I just wait for a second. And at the very end of the loop, I just send a message complete. So super simple. The only thing that you'll need to take from this is obviously what variables you'll need for the message, building the message, and then the API script. Everything else would be your process that you like to update.
So more or less just those 4 lines.
Yes.
And what's really neat is in our deployment script, we have it's probably maybe 20-ish or so scripts that it touches through different parts of its life cycle to make a deployment. It has to do things like domains and all kinds of stuff, snapshots and things. So we have all of these different scripts that are all running on server. And it would be really a big pain to have a lot of heavy lifting. So what we do is we more or less put those 4 lines into one line, because you can with a let statement. And we just plop that line in on various parts of our scripts that do a lot of heavy lifting. And we just change the message and the percentage value. And that's it. We literally copy and pasted one line of code into a few different scripts. And that gives us really, really rich, informative progress. So you can see it saying step 3, step 4 at the very bottom left corner there. Does that give you guys some ideas on interactivity between the server?
When you say a single line, so you've just got that single perform script, which is the send message, and then you just put everything in there within a let statement so that you just paste that one line.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't, because as long as you pass the global, the $BF state in, that global will persist through the entire life cycle of the perform script on server. So we don't bother to do too much there. We just pass, and that state has everything we need: the domain and the API key we fetch with the get column or get pref key, and that's it. Incidentally, if you're wondering how the progress bar moves smoothly like that,
I think I animated it somehow.
Probably a transition all or something like that. Maybe
Duration.
So it's really easy to do.
I noticed how I left the tab and it came back and it was still updating. So also Eduardo mentioned to kind of have a button here kind of to show that the front end isn't held up because it's being run on server. So you can still interact and do other things while your progress is updating. And this doesn't have to be a giant progress bar. You can have it in the corner somewhere. It says, hey, this is loading,
that's pretty big.
This is running. But yeah. That's that. I
should mention a couple other things. We made some really low level changes that you won't appreciate unless you've run into this. We used to have our actions processor used to be single threaded, and now it's kind of a pseudo multi-threaded. They're not totally concurrent threads, but the thread of actions is unique. So what that means is what used to happen is you would have an action and that would do something, and then it's another action that does something, and that calls another named action that does something as well, and so on. And these all do things, and then finally you show some success or whatever you do at the end. And if one of these was a utility hook that's getting data, and somebody came along and they clicked the button while that utility was doing hook, the actions processor kind of chunks along and it waits, right? There's a pause right here. It waits for this hook to come back. And in the past, when somebody clicked the button, that would cause that to resume and the actions would get a little bit buggered up. Now what we do is each action thread gets its own ID. So this workflow that I sort of showed here, as you go through, this is actually, even if it runs a named action, it's still maintaining the same ID all the way through the whole thing. And then this second button would get its own, let me grab a different color here. The second button gets its own thread here. This is really, really big because it makes the actions processing really, really robust. And where we discovered this is when we eat our own dog food. When we tried to build collaborative modules, we were noticing that the messages that we were sending were messing up the actions. So it's kind of a low-level bug thing, but it's a really powerful thing, and it allows us to it allows you to have all kinds of concurrent, slow-running processes happening. Same thing if you have two hooks. If you have two utility hooks running from these two buttons here, and this one takes 10 seconds and this one here takes 5 seconds, when this one returns, this is a totally separate hook and it won't interfere with the first one. They're totally isolated now. Does anybody have any other questions on messaging?
I just wanted to ask, Alessandro sent me some questions. Passing a variable to change the value. Yeah, so all we pass here is the, notice how I have a message .app. Message.app essentially just changes the app model. And then in my progress bar, you can see here, I just grab from the app model progress. So I'm sending it from here, app.progress. And then on the front end, I'm grabbing app.progress. So that's how you kind of send a variable. Is it possible to visualize this bar inside a FileMaker web visualization? Yeah. Yes and no. I mean, yes, you can use BetterForms inside FileMaker. We actually just built a really neat app that manipulates some PDF stuff, and we just needed we use BetterForms for that because it was the best tool for it. And you can talk to that web viewer app, BetterForms app. Now, there are some pros and cons. Generally, if you're using a web viewer on every layout and you're switching back and forth, it's reinstantiating the entire app. BetterForms is a single page application, so it's a little heavier on the initial load, and then subsequent loads are lighter. So you would have a little bit of a drawback there if you were to use it for that purpose, but you can certainly do that. But yeah, that wraps it up for me. Okay, I think what we're going to do is we're going to pause it here for content, and we'll just open up for some questions. But before we finish off, I want to we have a new thing, a new registration form, or sorry, a new registration process, a sign-up process instead of using Zoom. And we thank everybody for putting some detailed comments. It really, really does help us a lot. So we want to reward you by offering a bit of a swag draw or a giveaway. We have some different items and things like that, and one of our team will send some stuff out to you. But let me just pull up let's see if we, just a second, I'm going to share my screen here. Yeah, I'm gonna find it here. Close up my tabs. Okay, and sorry, it wasn't here. Okay, so basically, here we go. This is not everything that you're gonna get, but you'll get some items. We're building up an inventory of swag items that we can start to give away. Everybody who pre-registered up until, I don't know, 7 o'clock or something like this morning, you should have your name on this list here, and we'll see. I'm afraid to click it. If the person's not here, if it's one of the team, we'll click it again. I think that's it. All right, so let's see what we got. Oh, Mark. Is Mark in the call today? I know I seen Leonard come in. He was close. Mark going once? Going twice? I don't see him on here.
No, I don't see him either.
No Mark? Okay, so I can remove? I don't know what this does. This is not a BetterForms app. We wanted to build something like that, but we didn't. So somebody else built it, and that's fine. Okay, let's try again. This could be a while, who knows? And I think Dan's on the call, is he?
I think Dan is,
or did he leave?
Woohoo!
If he left, he's out of luck. Is Dan on here?
Yep, he's here.
All right, awesome. Congratulations, Dan. Dan, awesome. By the way, is like, I don't know if he's like number 1 or number 2 BetterForms user.
One.
Right? You think he's 1? Okay, I will say 1. They're all around the same, almost exact same. I think it actually is 1 though. So he's our very, very first BetterForms user. And we used to have, when BetterForms started, Madalena will contact you, Dan, for that, for getting some contact information. But when BetterForms started, we didn't have a UI. And Dan remembers, we never had any interface. There was no interface. You actually edited code more or less through a field in FileMaker. It was pretty hard, pretty challenging.
I actually I built an app in FileMaker for editing code.
Just for doing that, yeah. And we didn't have BetterForms wasn't a multi-tenant cloud application. It was an on-prem equivalent through a third-party Vercel hosting company. And Dan, I remember when I told Dan about editing it, and it was, I think you were like one of the last. You were one of the last ones to jump to the cloud version. So, yeah. Well, there's only 3, so couldn't have been too many. All right, awesome. Thank you. I'm going to stop our recording right here, and we'll hang out for a little bit. But thank you, everybody, for coming out. We're trying to set up some guests for the next Friday Live, and that'll be on how you can increase your consulting business using BetterForms is one of the topics that we're hoping to get some people in line with. If you are a dev house and you've built a number of apps, we'd love to hear from you. You know who you are out there, and possibly become guests, and we'd love to pick your brains on those things. All right, and we'll see everybody next month.